Hi, my name's Chap. If I haven't introduced myself yet, it's great to see you. It's so great to be back in town. Dee and I were gone for just about a week, 8 days actually, and our time away was to go to a place called Agongo, which is not so much a city or a village. It's a region of a whole lot of just little rural farms. And it's not from farmers that actually can make a living. There's so many reasons why they can't. Incredible poverty in a part of Africa, Western Kenya. It's about an hour from a city called Migori. And there's all kind of reasons why this group of people that we encountered would not have much joy. But Dee and I got to go there. St. Andrews has been connected to them for the folks in Agongo is called, for several years now. We were invited to go by people from our church, Larry Beatty and Sue Ann. Sue Ann didn't go, but Larry Beatty, and then Tom and Carol Brock, if you haven't met them. And what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is through a lot of generosity of folks here and also at Palm Desert Community Church, where Dave Ludwig, who used to work here, is a senior pastor, have sponsored children and helped them to build an infrastructure there. They have one of the best schools in Kenya, K to 12, roughly around 600 kids. And then they have an African Bible College is what it's called there, where they have roughly 35 students that are there. They come in for 2 weeks and they go back to their villages for 2 weeks. And so we got to go, and we dedicated a medical dispensary called the Candy Bayless Dispensary. And those of you that have been here for a while remember her as our children's director for many years, and an unbelievably wonderful, gracious, hardworking person. And so we got to dedicate this medical dispensary. It was amazing. I don't have much more time to talk about it, but I will tell you there are two things, impressions, while we were there. We were there for me to dedicate and also to speak at the graduation of the Bible College. But Dee and Carol actually did a women's empowerment conference there for women that have no reason to even consider being empowered. They live in a part of the world that is filled with just about everything throughout history that has held women back. Whether it is arranged marriages for polygamy when they're 11 years old to a man who may be 70, simply so she can work the fields, or whether it's genital mutilation, or whether it's AIDS is horrible there still, and disease, credible poverty, male domination that is horrifically abusive. And so Dee and Carol, and Dee got to give this kind of opening address, and man, it was something. Because through this interpreter, those women started to realize that they are created in the image of God. And Dee and Carol helped them to know how God feels about their circumstance. One of them said to one of our team, I really thought God had abandoned us. But over the last couple of years, we've seen that he hasn't. So we had to be there. Two things. One, an unbelievable joy. A lot like you guys. Way to go. But a joy that was just across the board. When we first drove up there and get out of the vehicles, and we had about 15 of these, like 20-something bodyguards dressed as men in black with shades. I mean, they did the whole deal all around us. And the kids would kind of run toward us with unbelievable joy and warmth. That was unusual in our experience in many other parts of the world. And secondly, they kind of worshiped at the drop of a hat. They didn't have an orderly time. They didn't really care about the time. We were supposed to be introduced, sort of, and it was supposed to last 15 minutes. Well, we got in there at 10, and then roughly at about noon, they started to introduce us. So they were just kind of going crazy. And all I could think of was the 11 o'clock service. And you guys, as crazy as you are, that's what I felt like. I felt like I was back home. Take a look at the way they do worship. May break out in that kind of dancing, and we really don't have time for that. Wild. One person, there's a little band up there, and somebody just decided they're going to lead singing, and no matter what else is going on, they'd get up there and they'd grab a mic, and the little band would start playing, and they'd start singing, and then about 10 of the women would stand up there and just kind of, see that, I'm not really capable of doing what they did, but I attempted it, didn't I? That was kind of dumb. And then another person kind of grabbed the mic, and it was seamless and organic, and their faith and trust in Jesus, not because they are poor and oppressed, but there's something so genuine that just infused all the crowd. So these several hundred people that were part of these experiences changed everything. Well, we're in a series now to lead us to Easter, to prepare our hearts and minds through this season called Lent, where we get to take stock of our life. And we're focusing on Paul's great words at the end of 1 Corinthians, that love chapter, where he says, "For now we know in part, but then we will know in full, even as we are fully known. But these three remain," Paul says: faith, which means trust, hope, and love. These three things remain. We hold on to them. And so we're taking a look for 2 weeks about faith and trust. And what is it? 2 weeks starting next week on hope, and then 2 weeks on love, leading us up through Palm Sunday to Good Friday and Easter. So that leads us to our text today. What does faith really mean for us? So it's Matthew 18, verses 1 to 5. And if you are able, I invite you to stand in honor of God's word. Matthew 18, 1 to 5. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" So he called a little child to him and placed that child among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God indeed. Way to go. Have a seat. This was not an isolated occurrence. This is kind of a regular, if not constant, conversation the disciples had with each other. They were kind of continuing to ask each other, who do you think's the greatest? And it wasn't talking about who's the greatest at the end of all things when Jesus comes again and he wipes away every tear. Well, who's great then? It's in the present tense. It's who's great now. Who's the greatest in God's kingdom? And we know this because there's other passages of Scripture that give us a little hint. In Mark chapter 9, what we read is this. Jesus had spent a day kind of traveling and teaching, disciples with him. And in verse 33 of Mark 9, then Jesus and his disciples came to Capernaum, a town. When he was in that house, he asked his disciples, "What were you guys arguing about on the road?" Now, it's really interesting. If you read above it, you'll go, well, when were they arguing? I don't see it there, because there's no indication that they were arguing. But Jesus is walking with them. Jesus is doing stuff. Long day, tired, finally kind of resting. And then he looks at them and goes, "You guys are arguing like crazy." It's kind of like the kids in the back seat of a van. And he goes, "What were you arguing about?" And verse 34 says, "But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest." It was a normal thing for them, a normal conversation. Well, it's an interesting thing. I don't know if you've heard of the term goat. Most of you have heard of the term goat. And we had a lot of goats where we were. In fact, we were given a goat and a chicken. The goat was for me. The chicken was for Dee. That's what they said. They brought us up to graduation. And I started to want to take that goat, and shove it in my suitcase, see if I can get it through security. And they go, no, it's a symbolic goat. Well, it sure looked real to me, and it sure smelled real to me. But I'm not talking about that kind of goat. A goat, greatest of all time. Even now, it's not limited to these guys with Jesus. Even now, we talk about who's the greatest of all time. And people, during the Super Bowl, it became a big topic of conversation when they're trying to drum up stories. Who's the greatest quarterback of all time? And because Tom Brady, who's approaching 60 years old, and plays like it, but he's being talked about as the greatest of all time. And wow, how do you actually say that? Come on. What about, You know, you got Bart Starr. If you don't know who he is, unbelievable. You got Joe Montana. You have the Hulk. You have Pee Wee Herman. You have all kind of different really great quarterbacks in their day. And the interesting thing about it, you can't really say who's the greatest because every person brings something different. Every situation is unique. But boy, do we love to say who is the greatest. We're part of a denomination called ECO, and we had a convention a few weeks ago. And at a convention, I went to this seminar. And when I was in this seminar, the guy up front said this statement: most of us don't see ourselves as disciples. And they repeated it later. Most people don't see themselves as disciples. And I thought, that's really a weird thing to say for a bunch of people that come to church, that would say, I love Christ, or I'm interested, or somebody dragged me here, or however I got here. But disciple, why wouldn't I see myself? Well, then you think about it. I wonder how many of you would say that about yourself. Would you call yourself a disciple? It's a word that actually simply means follower. It's got no qualifications. It's just you're a follower. Maybe it's too churchy. But maybe you think it's a word for those who are really serious about this stuff, and you go, yeah, I'm in, but that's not a word I'd use. Or there's a comparative kind of thing going on. Well, they're a disciple. That person's really great. They're the greatest disciple. What does that mean? And here come these guys saying to Jesus and arguing about it constantly, who's the greatest? Who's the best disciple? Boy, how does that make us feel? Where do you kind of fit on that scale? Depends on the criteria, I guess. But that's an interesting thing. So Jesus responds right here. You see it in this verse right here, verse 2. He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. It's such a little child that it didn't make a distinguish between a boy or a girl. It's like a 2 to 4-year-old probably. A little kid that if they're pulled into the middle to be used as what's called an object lesson, that we can learn something from this child, but the child's not old enough to know they're being an object lesson, so they can't screw it up. So it's just a small little child who is simply living their life. And Jesus pulls this child up. We don't know, boy or girl. And there they are, and he goes, see this child? And then he uses this really, really interesting line. Unless you guys change, he's talking to the disciples. Unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter my kingdom. You'll never get it. Something's got to happen. Something's got to change. We must change and become little. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I need to change how I act to become more humble? Does it mean I need to change how I treat people? Well, sure, some of those things would seem to apply, that the greatest are the ones that change enough to continue to look like the greatest. The problem is that's not what the word actually means. The word Jesus used does not mean to change the externals, does not mean to get everybody to notice your change. What the word change here means is to turn around, change of direction. Throughout the entire record that God reveals himself to be, we call the Bible, what's very clear is this thing that we call life is not static. It is constantly different. And we use words like a path or a road or a journey. It literally is a journey, and we can be walking in one of two directions in this journey. So what is Jesus saying? He's saying, unless, while you're asking the question, who's the greatest? Unless you change your direction, turn around, you will never know my kingdom. You will not even be in the game, much less the greatest. Because what you think is the greatest is the exact opposite of what it means to be the greatest in my kingdom. And it's about your direction, not about your performance or your status or your abilities. So two directions Jesus sets up. First, there's the direction of the goat. The direction of the greatest of all times, where I'm the great disciple, where I work hard to be someone who figures it out, either by my accomplishments or by my attempt to accomplish something, about my performance to make sure that I either feel good about myself or at least I fool others that they feel good about me. How do you become the greatest of anything? Well, you work hard at it. You figure out what your goals are, your priorities, and you try to make the most of it. And the more that you work at that, the more you seek to get on top of the heap of everybody else. That's the life we've been handed. It's not limited to American culture. It's around the world for all of time. We believe that we need to become the GOAT, the greatest of all time. There's a play that some of you have heard of, and probably many have not, called Death of a Salesman. It's had many renditions. It was actually on Broadway, a major play on Broadway, not too long ago. I don't know if it's still going on. But a man named Philip Seymour Hoffman, maybe you've heard of him. He's an Academy Award winner, brilliant actor, was the star of Death of a Salesman, this particular play. In Death of a Salesman, the lead is a guy named Willy Loman. And Willy Loman is a salesman who's trying to figure out how to make it through life, to dream about how can I get my plans fulfilled? How can I be the best salesman? How can I be the best dad? How can I have the world notice me and value me? And it's a very powerful film that's frightening to watch because every single one of us can find ourselves in Willy Loman. Well, Philip Seymour Hoffman was the star of this, and NPR interviewed him, and he said this: Willy Loman represents the idea that you have a vision of what you're supposed to be, or going to be, or where your kids are going to be, and that doesn't work out. Think about that for a second. This play, Willy Loman, the star, the salesman, represents the idea you have a vision of what you're supposed to be, are going to be, or what your kids are going to be. In other words, a vision of this is how life works, and I've got to get to the top of the heap. I've got to fulfill my goals. I've got to fulfill my calling. I need to make sense of this. And then Philip Seymour goes on to say it really seeps into why we're here, not in New York on a radio station, but we as people. It seeps into why we're here. We are what we are doing. Family, work, friends, hopes, dreams, careers. What's happiness? What's success? What does it mean? Is it important? How do you get it? And this line, ultimately what gets you up in the morning is to be loved. In the end, the play is about our yearning to be loved. Why do we want to figure out who the greatest is? Because we figure if we reach that pinnacle, then we will finally reach our greatest goal and our greatest need, and that is to be loved. But there's a lot of people asking Tom Brady about his career as he goes about. If you've heard of him, he's a football player, but he's already achieved everything he could. And the commentators in ESPN are starting to say he just wants somebody to look him in the eye and say, I love you. Philip Seymour Hoffman was found dead a year later with a needle in his arm. Because even though he could play this role brilliantly, he could not satisfy his own longing and aching in his heart. The disciples said, who's the greatest? I want to be the greatest. Notice me. I want to earn my way into your embrace. I want to perform my way to blessing. And Jesus said, oh, fellas, oh, gall, you've been with me. This is at the end of his earthly life. They'd been with him for 3 years, and they still are saying, Lord, we're going to finally arrive when we become the greatest. So they argued about it. And Jesus pulls up the little child. What's a child? What's a 2-year-old, 3-year-old? It's not about their humility, although they have that, but humility is simply an expression of your neediness, if it seeps in. It's their dependency that when they feel loved, they are set free. You watch a 2 or 3 year old in action, one who is well loved, well protected, and you see a freedom. You can even experience and be drawn in to a depth of abandonment that we've simply lost as we've tried to be the goat. After all, the goal for all of us is to be found worthy and to be loved. And a little child trusts the one who calls them and loves them, holds them, embraces them so they're set free to dance. So greatness isn't the point. We just want to be loved. So how do I change and work at becoming a child? And the disciples didn't quite get this until later, but how do I change? How do I turn around? What does it mean for me to turn around? Well, here's one way to do it, and this is how most of us probably do it, is I have been trained that I need to figure out how to make myself worthy and to make all of life work. And so now, if Jesus tells me to change, I am going to be the one to become a little child by working at it. Way too many people are dropping out of following Christ, especially those in your guys' age category, but also across the board of all of us. Because they say things like, I've tried Jesus. I've tried to serve him. I've tried to be the greatest. I've tried to make sense. I've tried to be humble. I've tried to do the things that are kind. I've tried to do all those religious deals by showing up, by writing a check, by being in a small group. But it isn't actually fulfilling me. One pastor that I've read is from Germany, Lutheran pastor, 1900, 120 years ago, gave lectures and in a book called What is Christianity? He said this: humility, and you could use any childlike virtue, innocence. Humility is not a virtue by itself, but it is pure receptivity, the expression of inner need, the prayer for God's grace and forgiveness. In a word, the opening of the heart to God. That's what it takes. That's what Jesus is talking about. The world we have grown up in, like all people have grown up in, is a world where we think we have to figure it out. And Jesus said, unless you turn around, unless you change your direction, your trajectory, you will never even see me. So as we turn toward him, we open our heart to him with a receptivity for who he is and what he wants to do with us. We think we have to manufacture life. But the key of following Christ is not to manufacture anything, but to turn away from our own agendas into his arms. This Agongo experience, it's that area near Migori, Kenya. One of the different times when they organically started doing these, wild dances, and it was kind of crazy. There's this one woman who is absolutely stately. She was taller than me, so she's about 6'3". And she's one of the ones that would kind of sit there, and she's kind of in the front row, and they had us over to the side in these big, huge padded chairs like Jesus used to sit in, and she would get up there and just do and like this, and stately and gorgeous like an African queen. As Del D and we couldn't remember her name, so we called her the African Queen, kind of like the old movie. And she would always be up there singing and dancing and grabbing the mic occasionally, but had this look about her of sheer, unfiltered joy and love for Christ. Well, then they started doing something that got a little weird. They started kind of dancing in a circle, almost like, a conga line or whatever. And they started dancing in a circle, and somebody said, hey, to Dee, and so Dee's my wife, and Dee jumped right in, man. She loved that. She started going for the dancing thing. And then Carol Brock also, she got up there and they're dancing. And I'm with the other two guys. One's 80-something, one's 70-something, and I'm somewhere over 37. And so I'm standing there with these guys, and I'm thinking, I love this. It's beautiful. It's majestic. But I want nothing to do with it personally. And then she kind of comes around, and this is kind of in the front there, and there must have been 30 people or so kind of crammed in, going in this big circle. The band's going crazy, singers and dancers. And she kind of comes around, and she catches my eye. And she looks at me while she's kind of doing this thing, kind of looks at me and smiles and holds her hand out. That's all she did, just smile and held her hand out, like in a way that's like, you take my hand or I'm a 6'3" African queen kind of look, you know? And as she did, somehow I turned around. Somehow I just allowed myself to reach out and grab her hand. And she gently pulled me up, didn't force me to jump into the dance or to get kind of crazy, just gently pulled me up and put me in front of her and just started helping me to move in sync with the other dancers. And I got to tell you, there have been few times in my life I've experienced such unfiltered joy. Being included, being a little child, set free by taking the hand of one who had come to love me. How do you turn? Some of you, there's no question, have been a believer for a long time. And some of you have never really made that turn. Maybe you did in high school, but in your heart, you know you've still been trying to figure out how to make your way and to get your life figured out, to be your own version of the goat. Well, that's the first step, is to take the hand of Christ as you turn and say, I'm tired. I can't make it work. Maybe you're really good at being great and it's not enough. Maybe you're really just an anxious person. Maybe you're scared of the virus or scared of a lot of other things. Maybe you're incredibly lonely, or maybe you're just, sad. Well, that's the first step in following Christ, is to make a turn and grab his hand. But for the rest of us that have been around church, the way you guys are singing, you know the words. And looking around at us, many of us have been believers a whole long time. It's not like we got to become a Christian again, but we still find ourselves on this pathway of self-sufficiency and self-dependency. And I'm still finding myself, it's not enough, or it's not working. Find myself anxious. Find myself lonely. Find myself sad. What does it mean for us to turn? Well, the life following Christ is a constant, regular conversion of turning. That's what Lent is about, our opportunity to turn and trust him. And as we turn, just like I did with that beautiful woman in Kenya, he holds his hand out, he smiles, and we take his hand. All it means is what Jesus was saying to them and to us today is, come to me. Unless you change, Chap, unless you turn around from self-dependency and self-sufficiency, unless you allow yourself to be changed by me, by taking my hand, you will never enter the kingdom of God. Oh, that we would come to Jesus.